It is the stuff of legends. The great Augustus Caesar hopes to push the Roman Empire beyond the boundaries of the civilized world. His faithful commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, is inexperienced and untested in the field of conflict. Varus and his army expect little in the way of resistance. They are tragically mistaken. Armed with spears and shields, a force of German tribesmen gather to face the might of Rome. At their head, a daring young chieftain by the name of Arminius.
It was one of the bloodiest battles of antiquity. When the slaughter was finished, 20,000 of Rome's finest lay dead or dying in the mud. So great was the shock that for years afterwards, Augustus is said to have beaten his head on a door, shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions."
Although the massacre left an indelible mark on history, the site of the battle disappeared in the tangle of an ancient forest. Today, archaeologists are reaping an unexpected harvest in a swatch of German farmland, hundreds of Roman artifacts. Have they found the site of Rome's defeat, the source of Caesar's nightmare? On a hill overlooking the city of Detmold in western Germany, an imposing statue immortalizes the young hero who stood against Rome. While the Romans mourned their defeat, the Germans celebrated it in myth and legend. But details of the battle seem lost forever to the passage of time. In the 1st century AD, Germany was a trackless land of mountains and forests, inhabited by tribes of warlike barbarians. Fiercely independent, they looked on the encroaching Romans with suspicion and dread. The century before, the great Julius Caesar had doubled the size of the Roman Empire. After subduing the Mediterranean, he turned northward and conquered Gaul, establishing a stronghold on the west bank of the Rhine. To consolidate Caesar's gains, the Emperor Augustus extended the frontier to the Danube. Next, he annexed the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe. An invasion seemed only a matter of time. But the Germans were ill-prepared. They needed a leader, someone charismatic who could unite them in a common cause, someone who could rally a force strong enough to confront a highly disciplined military machine. The young Arminius, only 27 years old, had unique credentials. Although a German chieftain, he was well trained in Roman tactics. As a Roman citizen, he had served in the army and sworn allegiance to the emperor, until Augustus made a fateful decision. He named Publius Quinctilius Varus governor of Germany. An aristocrat, Varus was also arrogant and tactless. His presence on German soil was all Arminius needed to spark a rebellion and unite the tribes. In 9 AD, Arminius seized his opportunity. He attacked Varus and his legions. After 3 days of fighting, the battle was over. 20,000 men, 10,000 camp followers were virtually annihilated. Unable to face the shame of such a catastrophe, Varus and his lieutenants committed suicide. Their voices silenced, Rome's most humiliating defeat in centuries faded into history. With few witnesses to recount the disaster, the whereabouts of the killing field also slipped away. For 2,000 years, no one has been certain exactly where the battle was fought. The search to find it would become one of the great detective stories of archaeology. It begins in the 16th century, when a manuscript written by the Roman historian Tacitus was discovered in a German monastery. Tacitus was the first to identify the Teutoburg forest, some 200 square miles of what is today gently rolling hills and woodlands. Over the years, Roman antiquities began to turn up in several different locations, but few associated them with the battle. Then, in 1987, an amateur archaeologist prospecting on a northern edge of the forest uncovered an unusual cache of new artifacts. The discovery attracted the attention of the Museum of Cultural History in nearby Osnabrück. The excavation, located at the foot of Kalkreiser Mountain, has yielded hundreds of tiny fragments, each a clue that here something dramatic occurred. After years of painstaking analysis, Chief Archaeologist Susanne Wilbers-Rost and her team have pieced together the uniform of a Roman soldier and the weapons he carried.
We found, for example, this hook to fasten the epaulettes of a chainmail coat. It mentions a certain Marcus Aius of the first cohort of Fabricius.
The first cohort was the elite unit of a Roman legion. The find is hard evidence that heavily armed infantry were present in the area.
This javelin clamp was used to attach the iron to the wooden shaft of a Roman javelin, a very long weapon. The base section of the javelin could be driven firmly into the ground. The sandals were very important. They were made of leather and had iron cleats in the soles. The helmet had a plume holder on which plumes could be fixed on special occasions. A Roman dinar, a silver coin. I don't know if you've already seen this. Look, there is a galley on it, a ship. Down here you can see the oars. We have several of this type. That fits into the context. But it's a rarity on this site. On this excavation, we've only found 6 or 7 silver coins.
These scattered relics of a Roman army bear mute testimony to an ancient conflict. But is it the infamous battle of 9 AD? Among the discoveries are a collection of copper coins. Wolfgang Schlutter, director of the museum, believes that they hold the answer.
Wir haben hier eine solche Kupfermünze.
Here we have a copper coin, of which we have found about 200 so far. These are surely only a fraction of the coins lost here. And these coins are the best way to date this event.
Roman soldiers were paid in copper coins. On one side was the hallmark of the Emperor Augustus. On the other, the stamp of their commander, Quintilius Varus.
In the year 7 AD, Varus became the governor of Germania. Therefore, it was only from this date that he could put his stamp on the coin. So we can say on the one hand, we have found no coins dating after 9 AD, and because these coins were produced starting in the year 7, they could only have been lost in the year 7, 8, or 9. This would indicate that we have situated the Varus battle in 9 AD.
The location of the forgotten battleground now seems certain. Archaeologists have also excavated a strange-looking mound at the base of the mountain. Their work reveals a man-made rampart some 600 feet long and 7 feet high.
We suspect that the Romans came from the east. That is to say, they came from this direction and marched along this path. They were attacked from different ramparts, which in our opinion, the Germans had built for the ambush. So far, we have excavated only one of these ramparts. That rampart lies over in that direction, at the foot of the Kalkreiser Mountain. This is the old ground level, from the time of the Romans. It clearly marks the outer edge of the rampart. The Romans came along this path, just below here. Then they were attacked from the rampart and were clearly annihilated.
The construction of a rampart suggests Arminius knew which route the advancing Roman column would take. But how did he know? Wolfgang Schlutter thinks his knowledge of the terrain gave the Germans an edge.
Die römischen Truppen sind von Osten gekommen.
The Roman troops came from the east. Now, presumably, they tried to get through here, between the Kalkriese mountain and the Wien mountain range. But they had to admit it was impossible due to the high altitudes. They retreated and went around the mountain using the shortest path possible to surmount this obstacle.
Das heißt, dieses Hindernis zu umgehen. Die römischen Truppen hatten jetzt zwei Möglichkeiten.
The Roman troops had two possibilities.
In einem langen
Either they could march in a long queue for 10 or 12 kilometers, in which case they were vulnerable to attack from the side, or they could march in wide formation, but then they faced continual traffic jams at the narrow passage points. Imagine a three-lane highway narrowing to one lane. Then you get traffic jams for many kilometers. And that is exactly what happened here.
Schlutter's findings confirmed Tacitus's account of the battle. Varus led his army through treacherous terrain. On one side, Tacitus records, it was flanked by marshes, bogs, and swamps. On the other, by densely wooded hills. Here, they encountered the ambush. It is deathly quiet in the Teutoburg forest. An autumn rain chills the air. The Germans, invisible behind their earthen ramparts, patiently wait. Anticipation steels their nerves. In the distance can be heard the footfalls of the approaching Romans. Then finally, out of the mist, a golden eagle appears, the battle standard of a Roman legion. Troops, pulled apart by the long march, are caught by surprise. Trapped in close quarters, their spears and swords become useless. Combat is hand to hand. Within moments, the dying begins. Archaeologist Michael Geschter thinks the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was no battle at all. It was a massacre.
Diese kleinen Truppen römischer Soldaten, die eigentlich nur
These troops of Roman soldiers were only trained to fight in open fields.
geeignet,
They were not suited to ward off small partisan attacks.
Angriffe abzuwehren und
Because of this, they were massacred man for man.
Tage hin.
Isolated troops were able to fight their way through,
Andere
others surrendered and were butchered.
oder wieder andere kämpften
And still others fought on,
von den
but were overrun by the Germans, who were more familiar with the terrain.
germanischen Truppen überrannt wurden.
The overwhelming success of their ambush may explain why few German artifacts have been found. Mostly the fragments of a Roman army literally torn to shreds, their bodies and their weapons plundered. How could such a disaster befall an army that time after time followed Julius Caesar into battle and reigned victorious? Christopher Ruger, professor of Roman studies at the University of Bonn, thinks Quinctilius Varus was to blame.
He acquired his experience in provincial administration in quite a different hotspot of Rome. Syria, that was at the time, Palestine. It was as turmoily, as rebellious as it is now between Israel and all the Arab states. There were factions, there were PLOs, there were Haganahs and whatnot, and Varus pretty well muddled through this sort of mess in the east. But he never had experience with a guerrilla warfare beyond north of the Alps.
Arminius dagegen war ein
Arminius, on the other hand, was a young German nobleman of the Cherusker tribe who had worked for the Romans as an auxiliary troop leader and had Roman citizenship.
auch römischer Bürger und
He was highly familiar with Roman military tactics.
Arminius
And this explains why Arminius knew the weaknesses of Roman military tactics when marching through difficult territory.
durch unwegsames Gelände.
His plan of attack in the Teutoburg forest was based on this knowledge.
Eben auch sein Angriffsplan im Bereich des Teutoburger Waldes.
They operated in small units, and in on swampy, marshy grounds, in forests, as Tacitus recalls. And of course the Romans were afraid of the forest, whereas the Germanic warriors just loved the bushes. They just loved the bush. They were able to operate very much more efficient in a country like that.
Zum anderen ist auch dazu zu sagen, dass es im September jetzt...
It should also be said that it was raining that September, and the Roman equipment became heavy since it was becoming waterlogged. The Germans, of course, had no armor, only simple wooden shields. Accordingly, their equipment did not become as heavy as that of the Roman soldiers.
When the Romans were ambushed, they were heading back to their winter quarters at Haltern, a heavily fortified garrison east of the Rhine. A team of archaeologists, led by Rudolf Askamp, director of the Roman Museum in Haltern, have been excavating the site.
Das Lager von Haltern wurde wahrscheinlich...
Archaeologists now believe that the camp of Haltern was probably built around the year 0. The camp existed up to the year 9 AD, when it was destroyed in connection with the slaughter in the Teutoburg forest. We have evidence that one of the legions that went under in this massacre was the 19th Legion. It was previously stationed in Haltern.
In Haltern vorher stationiert war.
We have cleared the bones of the dirt and are now reinforcing them with plaster so that we can get them to the museum intact. Otherwise, they would break. Over here, we see the remains of the skull. We have only the outline, which we can just barely recognize. Here, I'm going around once. Next, we see where the spinal cord, that is the neck, was attached to the head. And over here is what would have been the upper body.
Archaeologists now believe that Haltern was destroyed by the Germans as part of a larger strategy to stop the empire's expansion and eventually weaken its grip on the Rhine. 6 years after the battle, Augustus, bent on revenge, sent his son-in-law Germanicus back into the Teutoburg forest. According to Tacitus, the scene lived up to all its horrible associations. A half-ruined breastwork and shallow ditch showed where the last pathetic remnant had gathered. On the open ground were whitening bones, scattered where men had fled, heaped up where they had stood and fought back. Fragments of spears and of horses' limbs lay there, also human heads fastened to tree trunks. In groves nearby were the outlandish altars at which the Germans had massacred the Roman colonels and senior commanders. Germanicus conducted several retaliatory raids against the Germans. Among his duties was an order to retrieve the golden eagles of the 3 lost legions captured by Arminius during the battle. And at stake was the pride of the Roman army.
Die 3 Legionen, die dort vernichtet wurden.
The 3 legions that were destroyed, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, never existed again. It was typical of the Romans not to reinstate a destroyed legion.
It was an unheard loss ever since Carthage and Hannibal's battles. It was the biggest blow to the Roman army. So many losses, 30,000 people lost. They could have recruited them back in a whiff, in a year's time, but it affected Roman pride. It affected the Gloria Romanorum. The big issue of Rome was the pride of its army, and that was affected. So it was much more a political blow than a military one.
Die Adler sind natürlich dann
The eagles were brought back to Rome, and then we don't know. Either they were destroyed or melted down in the course of the centuries.
The Battle of Teutoburg Forest, once and for all, put an end to the dream of expansion. Today, the monument in Detmold commemorates a fleeting moment of glory, but it also serves as a reminder Without Arminius, the hero of Teutoburg Forest, one can only wonder how history might have been different.
Blooded by the loss of his crack legions, Augustus never again dared turn a coveting eye on the lands beyond the Rhine and Danube. For him and his successors, the loss marked a first crack in the imperial shield. For the Germanic peoples, it planted the seeds of a national consciousness that would transform the ancient world.
Carthage and Rome, initially equal in power, were destined for conflict. The Carthaginians, based in North Africa, dominated the Mediterranean on the south, with colonies across Africa and into Spain. Rome was beginning its ascent at the same time, engulfing most of Italy and beginning to expand its power to the west. Carthage was known for its naval power, but the existence of the large and magnificent port of Carthage, described in detail by the Greek historian Appian, remained shrouded in mystery for centuries. It was only in 1974 that archaeologists were able to conclude that the port was near modern-day Tunis. This is what the tremendous harbor of Carthage looked like at that time. Ships would return from the sea into two pier areas, one for commercial ships and one for military. Carthage's modern, fearsome warships gave them uncontested dominion on the seas. Rome, on the other hand, was powerful on land. Their war strategists continually innovated and developed siege and war machines that their enemies had never encountered. It would have been easier for Carthage to attack Rome by sea. But instead, Hannibal, Carthage's great general, thought he would surprise Rome. He planned a bold overland expedition to attack Rome. He would take with him 90,000 infantry, 12,000 horsemen, and 40 elephants. His first move was to attack an ally of Rome, a city called Saguntum in Spain. Roman soldiers were already in the city as observers when Hannibal arrived. When the citizens heard that Hannibal was on his way, they called an emergency session to discuss war. These assemblies were held in open spaces or in theaters such as this one from the imperial age. Saguntum asked for help from Rome, but Rome was undecided, not sure whether it was wise to get involved in a war with Hannibal. That indecision is still famous today thanks to the proverb, "While they debate in Rome, Saguntum falls." The city held out for 8 months against Hannibal's siege, but it was finally overrun and destroyed in 218 BC. The Carthaginians took the surviving citizens of the city and sold them as slaves, a habit the Romans practiced as well. But the Roman soldiers who were there, they took along as hostages. When archaeologists started excavating in the Carthaginian region, from northern Africa to Spain and Sardinia, they found a great quantity of objects. Some decorative, such as these colorful glass pieces, and jewelry like this, and others whose meaning was unclear. It took archaeologists years of work and hundreds of comparisons to objects of various sites to figure out that they were almost all amulets or good luck charms. To ward off evil, there were the smirking masks. While to protect against snake bite or scorpion stings, big dangers in northern Africa, there was the path pateko. The hands of these statuettes try to indicate to the gods the position of the pain. Carthaginian art was thus strongly tied to magic, as well as being in great demand throughout the Mediterranean. Statues, busts, and friezes tell the tale of heroic or mythological journeys. In the Roman cities, great quantities of art objects adorned the houses and were found everywhere on the streets. Some were copies of Greek masterpieces, but most portrayed Roman subjects. What were they for? Were they purely for aesthetics, or were they commemorating some event? Actually, the Romans loved art and used it widely in their rich and luxurious homes. But along the roads and in public spaces, the intention was not aesthetic, but political. Researchers discovered that the various sculptures and depictions were used to spread political and civil agendas, or to magnify Roman conquests. They were also used as propaganda for the family or political party that financed the works. The Romans were the first to understand the power of images to influence public opinion. As the Romans and Carthaginians met on the battlefield and interacted with each other, the art and culture of the different civilizations became intriguing to both. Although enemies, the two empires thirsted for knowledge of the other. After sweeping through Spain, the powerful Carthaginian army advanced into France, to the banks of a deep and wide river, the Rhone. The elephants, the Sherman tanks of Hannibal's army, who were able to rout any enemy that dared to get in their way, refused to get their toes wet, in spite of their usual obedience to their masters. How then could they get these animals across the river? The writer Polybius revealed Hannibal's simple but ingenious solution. Hannibal built a floating pier of rafts anchored at one end to large boats and at the other to strong trees. He then had the rafts covered with soil to fool the animals. Two females calmly walked out onto the pier, and all the males followed. When all the elephants were afloat, Hannibal had the moorings cut, so the rafts started moving toward the other side. The elephants were filled with fear as they saw the bank receding, but soon quieted down and made it across. Hannibal was on his way to Rome. But one major obstacle stood in his way: the Alps. Getting through the Alps was an enterprise no one had ever attempted. Along the way, amidst blistering snowstorms and dangerous precipices that dropped thousands of feet, Hannibal lost half of his army and half of his animals. But he did it. Arriving on the other side, he took the Romans completely by surprise. The Carthaginian army scored victories on the Ticino and Trebia rivers, at Lake Trasimeno, and lastly at Cannae. Many Italian cities betrayed Rome to ally themselves with Hannibal, including Capua. The unbroken string of battles won by the Carthaginians brought the army all the way to the south of Rome, and here, knowing he was master of the house, Hannibal indulged in a nice long rest. He must have enjoyed the lush countryside and the natural beauty that the south of Italy has to offer, and he indulged in learning about Roman customs and the Roman people. The Romans as well were learning about their neighbors from the south, their lifestyle, their habits, and customs. The cross-pollination of cultures left archaeologists trying to explain many of their discoveries. What were these molds for? What did they cook in these pots? And what did the Carthaginian wine, referred to in several historical accounts, actually taste like? Studies and comparisons among various references and relics helped us discover that the Carthaginians were master confectioners, or makers of sweets, and that these molds were used to decorate their candies. Fine. Dogs, however, numerous among the Romans and trained to be man's friend, were not kept as pets by the Carthaginians. Instead, they ate them. Can you imagine sitting down at the Carthaginian table and inquiring about the meat you were being served? Maybe after you had a few glasses of the very strong-flavored Carthaginian wine, however, you wouldn't care. Rome also was a land of avid wine drinkers. Presses like the one we see reconstructed here allowed for abundant production, but Punic or Carthaginian wines were also imported to Rome. Passum was the Roman term for the special Carthaginian wine. Wine made from dried grapes, the passito, that is still among Italy's most famous wines, was introduced to the region by the Carthaginians. The Bardo Museum in Tunis has the world's largest collection of Carthaginian objects. Necklaces, pins, brooches, rings, and buckles to beautify the Punic women. Mirrors, variously shaped ointment jars, and combs were everyday objects for enhancing the feminine allure of both Carthaginian and Roman women. After a long rest, it was time for Hannibal to pick up his weapons again. Rome, feeling safe within its walls, waited. Hannibal wanted to show the Romans that he could reach their gates without difficulty, and he did. He set up camp at the doors to the Eternal City, waiting for some sign from destiny. If Hannibal had entered Rome, he would have seen the people offering sacrifices before the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill. This is how it probably looked in all its ancient splendor. The rectangular temple was 260 feet long and 180 feet wide. It was the largest temple of all those built in the Italic Etruscan period. It was built by the Tarquins, kings of Etruscan origins, who governed Rome at the end of the monarchic period. The temple dates back to the 6th century BC and was a colossal work for that time. It was a symbol of Roman power for centuries and served as a model, even in the imperial epic, throughout the provinces taken over by Rome. Its grandeur is exemplified by the columns, nearly 65 feet tall, laid out in 6 lines, and by the decorations on the facade that were covered with terracotta medallions painted in a variety of colors. On the Capitoline Hill, the Romans held their most important ceremonies, such as the Comitia Tributa, meetings during which the plebeians or people of Rome elected their representatives. In addition, victorious generals returning from battle would celebrate with a solemn sacrifice in front of the temple. And lastly, it was here that every year on the 1st of January, the consuls, the supreme magistrates of the Roman Republic, were appointed. They ran the state and had full powers and control over the army, but held office for only 12 months, almost like king for a year. These two temples, on the other hand, not far from each other, were devoted to the business or commercial aspects of Rome at that time. Archaeologists came to this conclusion after analyzing a series of clues. The circular temple contained the base of a statue bearing an inscription. They were able to read the names of the sculptor and that of a wealthy merchant, along with the god to whom the sculpture was dedicated, Hercules Olivarius, protector of the Oil Merchants Guild. The other is dedicated to Portunus, an older god of the harbor. The river port of Rome on the Tiber must have been nearby. Outside the city, Hannibal stared at walls protecting the city that looked more difficult to overcome than the Alps. These walls date to the 4th century BC and are called the Servian walls. They were built using the top edge technique, whereby one stone is set on its side and the next one on its edge. This system allowed them to construct a wall over 30 feet high and 13 feet thick. Stretching almost 7 miles, the walls enclosed an area of over 1,000 acres. The Romans felt they needed them that strong after a bad experience with the Gauls, who had made it into the city. These walls gave the Romans a sense of security, and they didn't seem terribly concerned about Hannibal's presence. In writings from those days about the siege, it states that the land on which Hannibal had set up camp just outside of the city was sold while he was there, and its value didn't even decrease, meaning that someone expected it to be vacated soon. The massive walls and the strength of the Roman army behind them ended up discouraging Hannibal, who had no sophisticated war machines with which to attack the city. The Carthaginian leader also realized that he had made a tactical error by leaving behind several cities that were still faithful to Rome and ready to intervene in her defense. Hannibal withdrew, and as a gesture of goodwill that was unexplainable for someone whom many portrayed as a barbarian, set free his prisoners. The Roman soldiers, who were his captives for 7 full years, entered a festive Rome as free men. Hannibal remained in Italy for quite some time until Carthage itself was threatened by a Roman general, Africanus Scipio. Hannibal left to defend Carthage, and at Zama, near Carthage, lacking cavalry, he was defeated decisively by Scipio. Hannibal fled to the court of King Antiochus III of Syria, and Rome imposed extremely harsh peace conditions on the Carthaginians. The fame of the great leader and the hope of finding his traces drove archaeologists to dig at the hill of Byrsa. Historians and legend maintained that a city was founded there, and it was there that the only remaining Punic settlement was discovered. Archaeologists call this place Hannibal's Quarters. And it would have looked like this. Since Rome had now routed another enemy, it was business as usual in the city, and that meant the daily offering of sacrifices to the gods. Religious functions were held in front of temples containing statues portraying the gods. This huge temple was divided into 3 separate areas called cellas, each one devoted to a particular divinity. The most important and grandiose was dedicated to the king of the Roman Olympus, Jupiter. Because of his supreme position, his cella was in the middle, and his portal was larger than the others. The 2 cellas on either side had lower and narrower portals, indicating to worshippers that they housed lesser gods. The cella on the left was dedicated to Jupiter's wife, known to the Romans as Juno. She protected women, marriage, and fertility, thus guaranteeing the propagation of the Roman race. The other cella, on Jupiter's left, is dedicated to Minerva, goddess of science and literature, protector and custodian of the city of Rome. The 3 gods were the most widely worshipped in the Roman Olympus, and, thanks to the practical spirit that characterized the Romans even when it came to religion, they were all gathered in one place. Thousands of pounds of precious incense were offered throughout the Roman Empire to these 3 gods, the Capitoline Triad. On the other side of the Mediterranean, in Carthage, the Punic religion encompassed more intimate and mysterious aspects. The Carthaginian gods, more than being human-like figures, represented mysterious forces that were invigorated when nourished by the sacrifice of living blood. In 1921, during a clandestine dig, a tomb raider found this stone slab, or stele. It portrays a priest with a child in his arms. It would soon be famous throughout the world, triggering a debate that has continued to this day. Archaeologists began excavating where the stele had been found, and found other steles, urns, ashes, and bones of children. They had uncovered the Tophet of Carthage, the world's largest children's cemetery. But was it a cemetery or a place of sacrifice? The archaeologists revealed a shocking practice. The children were put into a fire and cremated in a ceremony known as molk. Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian, tells us that the Carthaginians offered their own live children to the gods. The last archaeologist to excavate the Tophet was the American Lawrence Steger. Using the context in which the urns were found and various historical sources, including the Bible, he reached the same conclusion, that the sacrifices really occurred. But the preeminent scholar of the Punic world, Sabatino Moscati, is of a different opinion. He believes the Tophet is merely a cemetery for children. His thinking is based on the absence of children's graves in other cemeteries in the ancient cities. Carthage itself was burned to the ground during the Third Punic War in 146 BC. But the Romans eventually rebuilt the city, culturally harmonizing it with their own tastes. It became the #2 city in the Roman Empire. On the Bursa Hill, an immense basilica was built, whose thick colonnade is still standing. Wealthy Romans, new to Africa, built magnificent villas on the slopes leading down to the sea. This villa, called the Aviary for the bird motif mosaic that paves its courtyard, is one of the most sumptuous. The reception hall is paved in marble, and it includes a garden theater, complete with stage and stalls. The Romans brought their architecture to Carthage, along with their games, their art, and their elegant lifestyle that today still shines with a rare beauty. The Carthaginian civilization, 1,000 years older than Rome, more or less disappeared into the history books, though a few traces can still be found throughout the Mediterranean basin. It was the Romans, however, who emerged victorious and passed their culture on to posterity. A culture, however, that contains a wealth of indelible contributions from the Carthaginians. Little did Hannibal know that his legacy was to help in this cross-cultural exchange.
Had unique credentials. Although a German chieftain, he was well trained in Roman tactics. As a Roman citizen, he had served in the army and sworn allegiance to the emperor, until Augustus made a fateful decision. He named Pilius Quinctilius Varus governor of Germany. An aristocrat, Varus was also arrogant and tactless. His presence on German soil was all Arminius needed to spark a rebellion and unite the tribes. In 9 AD, Arminius seized his opportunity. He attacked Varus and his legions. After 3 days of fighting, the battle was over. 20,000 men, 10,000 camp followers were virtually annihilated. Unable to face the shame of such a catastrophe, Varus and his lieutenants committed suicide. Their voices silenced, Rome's most humiliating defeat in centuries faded into history. With few witnesses to recount the disaster, the whereabouts of the killing field also slipped away. For 2,000 years, no one has been certain exactly where. It is the stuff of legends. The great Augustus Caesar hopes to push the Roman Empire beyond the boundaries of the civilized world. His faithful commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, is inexperienced and untested in the field of conflict. Varus and his army expect little in the way of resistance. They are tragically mistaken. Armed with spears and shields, a force of German tribesmen gather to face the might of Rome. At their head, a daring young chieftain by the name of Arminius.
It was one of the bloodiest battles of antiquity. When the slaughter was finished, 20,000 of Rome's finest lay dead or dying in the mud. So great was the shock that for years afterwards, Augustus is said to have beaten his head on a door, shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions."
Although the massacre left an indelible mark on history, the site of the battle disappeared in the tangle of an ancient forest. Today, archaeologists are reaping an unexpected harvest in a swatch of German farmland. Hundreds of Roman artifacts. Have they found the site of Rome's defeat? The source of Caesar's nightmare? On a hill overlooking the city of Detmold in western Germany, an imposing statue immortalizes the young hero who stood against Rome. While the Romans mourned their defeat, the Germans celebrated it in myth and legend. But details of the battle seem lost forever to the passage of time. In the 1st century AD, Germany was a trackless land of mountains and forests, inhabited by tribes of warlike barbarians. Fiercely independent, they looked on the encroaching Romans with suspicion and dread. The century before, the great Julius Caesar had doubled the size of the Roman Empire. After subduing the Mediterranean, he turned northward and conquered Gaul, establishing a stronghold on the west bank of the Rhine. To consolidate Caesar's gains, the Emperor Augustus extended the frontier to the Danube. Next, he annexed the territory between the Rhine and the Elbe. An invasion seemed only a matter of time. But the Germans were ill-prepared. They needed a leader, someone charismatic who could unite them in a common cause, someone who could rally a force strong enough to confront a highly disciplined military machine. The young Arminius, only 27 years old. The first cohort was the elite unit of a Roman legion. The find is hard evidence that heavily armed infantry were present in the area.
This javelin clamp was used to attach the iron to the wooden shaft of a Roman javelin, a very long weapon. The base section of the javelin could be driven firmly into the ground. The sandals were very important. They were made of leather and had iron cleats in the soles. The helmet had a plume holder on which plumes could be fixed on special occasions. A Roman dinar, a silver coin. I don't know if you've already seen this. Look, there is a galley on it, a ship. Down here you can see the oars. We have several of this type. That fits into the context. But it's a rarity on this site. On this excavation, we've only found 6 or 7 silver coins.
These scattered relics of a Roman army bear mute testimony to an ancient conflict. But is it the infamous battle of 9 AD? There the battle was fought. The search to find it would become one of the great detective stories of archaeology. It begins in the 16th century, when a manuscript written by the Roman historian Tacitus was discovered in a German monastery. Tacitus was the first to identify the Teutoburg forest, some 200 square miles of what is today gently rolling hills and woodlands. Over the years, Roman antiquities began to turn up in several different locations, but few associated them with the battle. Then, in 1987, an amateur archaeologist prospecting on a northern edge of the forest uncovered an unusual cache of new artifacts. The discovery attracted the attention of the Museum of Cultural History in nearby Osnabrück. The excavation, located at the foot of Kalkreiser Mountain, has yielded hundreds of tiny fragments, each a clue that here something dramatic occurred. After years of painstaking analysis, Chief Archaeologist Suzanne Wilbers-Rost and her team have pieced together the uniform of a Roman soldier and the weapons he carried.
We found, for example, this hook to fasten the epaulettes of a chainmail coat. It mentions a certain Marcus Aius of the first cohort of Fabricius.